Welcome my beloved student, how you doing? Hope you all are doing great and lovely. In this video we are gonna see, what if Deku awoke a hidden dragon quirk? This is part 1 and for more amazing content leave a like, share and subscribe. And I wanna thank the author of this story named Smothered Sparks by Sirteddison. So do check out and leave kudos. Let's get in the video. For Izuku, there really was nothing quite like a home-cooked meal. It was uncanny how just with a few bites of his mother's food, he felt like a little kid again, that same steady need for comfort and his mother that had barely let up even as he'd gotten older. Izuku had always been small for his age, always felt even smaller than that. It made it easy for his mom to wrap her arms around her son, able to provide a steady comfort at all times. Her warmth always made Izuku feel vulnerable, both like it was too much and yet not enough at the same time. He loved his mother, no one could truly send him back to his childhood like the lovely woman could through just a simple meal. Yes, Izuku loved his mother a lot, no matter how out of place he felt, how uncomfortable in his own skin, she was always there to provide her baby with anything he needed. Since moving into dorms, Izuku really missed that comfort. It was fine at first, getting used to his classmates was difficult but tolerable. He loved learning more about who they were outside of their quirks. But even after just a week away from home, Izuku started to feel off. Stress could do strange things. His body ached constantly, day and night, feeling like his joints were stretching outwards, then squeezing in again in pulsating cramps. His skin was acting up as well, Izuku always had clear, moisturized skin. Now however it was dry and peeling, a constant itch just under the surface that distracted him often. His body temperature was completely messed up, it was like he couldn't get comfortable. Either everything was freezing and he had to wrap himself in every warm thing he owned, or it felt like he was on fire, dripping sweat and his skin literally burning hot to anyone else. He wondered if this was how Todoroki felt when first learning to regulate his quirks, or maybe it was just weird puberty kicking Izuku's ass once more. After the long week of odd stress his body placed him under, it was an extreme relief to eat his mother's food, which again seemed to fill him with that odd childhood vulnerability more and more with each bite. The moment he'd stepped foot into his mother's house, the woman had been fussing over him. "Oh Izuku baby, you look so tired sweetie. Here, have a cup of tea and sit down. I made cookies and dinner is just starting. I know how hungry my baby boy can get. Just rest while mommy takes care of you, okay?" Yes, his mother's babying was odd, but it was something he was used to, and honestly sometimes it was just a relief to have someone care so much about him, even if it was at times rather smothering. The tea was perfect as always, and the cookies were fresh and gooey. It only took a few moments for the effects to sink in and that familiar feeling entering his veins. Usually it was a softer sort of feeling, I guess he must just have really been missing his mom, brains can be strange. He let himself sink into the couch and rested his eyes. He felt oddly dizzy. Not too bad, he was probably just dehydrated, he always forgot to drink water at school. He stood up from the couch and walked over to grab a glass of water, the moment he reached the kitchen, his mother jumped up with a squeak. She leaned over a cutting board, chopping something strange Izuku didn't recognize. She covered it up quickly and ran forwards to meet her son with worried eyes. "Izuku baby, I thought I told you to rest while I take care of dinner," she reprimanded, the light scolding made Izuku flush. Not just flush, some of that intense heat came out of his nose as well, like he'd eaten some of Kachan's spicy tofu. "Sorry mama, I was just going to grab some water," he defended, gesturing to the cabinet he was about to reach into. No Zuku, I'll take care of it. Go sit," she demanded, almost shoving him out of the kitchen. Reluctantly, the teen sat back onto the couch and waited as he heard the woman fussing around the kitchen. Minutes later, she came out with a large glass lemonade topped off with half a dozen ice cubes. Izuku felt his eyes well with tears and the sudden gesture. "Oh mom, you didn't have to go all out like that. I could have just had water," he sputtered, arms waving dramatically. "Nonsense." She waved his worries off and gave him a syrupy sweet smile. "I love taking care of my baby boy." She gave him the glass and watched expectantly as he took a sip. It was acidic and sweet, absolutely delicious just like everything his mom made was. She smiled at her son and ran back towards the kitchen after smoothing down her apron. As much as Izuku wanted to savor the drink, his thirst took over and he finished it in a matter of sips. The last sip was strange, almost chalky. Odd, maybe their dishwasher was acting up again, it hadn't been cleaning dishes properly since 3rd grade when Kachan accidentally blasted the control panel with his quirk. The memory came to Izuku with a comfortable sort of sweetness. It was just like he said, his mother's food took him back to his childhood in ways he couldn't explain. Dinner was ready soon after, and Izuku was led to the table decorated with his favorite meal, katsudon. His bowl was already made and sitting in front of his usual spot. He nearly stumbled into his seat and immediately began to wolf down his favorite dish. He paused after a couple bites and let his eyes shut, just savoring the moment. At home he felt vulnerable and open, like his mom could pry into any secret or idea Izuku may have see right through it, usually finding some way to coddle him with it. He loved his mom so very much that sort of smothering was at this point more a comfort to him than something novel. She always treated her little boy with the utmost care. Izuku hadn't realized how odd it would feel after getting used to Yue. At home he was coddled and wrapped in a bubble, he was Inko's baby boy, he wasn't strong or all that smart, but she loved him anyways. Yue was so different. He was respected, as an ally, as an opponent, as a friend. Sometimes he forgot that he wasn't that quirkless kid anymore, that he was so much more than that. It seemed his mother sometimes forgot as well, no matter how much strength he showed, he would always be his mother's baby boy and always needed to be protected in her eyes. The mother's love was strong, he supposed. And if something seemed horribly wrong in his brain at that thought, the teen ignored it in favor of the meal he was currently enjoying. Yes. Izuku very much loved his mom, and she loved him too. A whole lot, so much so it was stifling. But that was how it was supposed to be, she just wanted to protect him, to keep him safe. It was only natural after all. Wow, he was dizzy. Fuck, and why was his mouth so dry? He reached for oolong tea on his placemat and took a long sip, only to find that chalky aftertaste in his mouth again. He tried to stand, but his legs felt numb, his knees all wobbly as he tried to take to his feet. His mom was now grabbing his arm, supporting him, always a constant support. She was saying something, he couldn't quite make out the words. Everything was blurry and the world seemed to spin. Her nails began to dig into his skin, grounding him a bit more in reality. Mom? Don't worry sweetie, I'll take care of you okay? I always will. Her voice faded out again and Izuku began to panic. Why wasn't she more concerned? He could barely stand. He needed help. Why was she still muttering? Yue? He managed to stutter out, his lips felt like lead. His mouth felt stuffed with cotton. No Izuku. Her voice was harsher now, anger slipping through her bubbly demeanor. I'm taking care of you, you need me, Zuku, not that school. Come on now baby, let's get you settled for a nap. Her grip on his arm tightened and he felt his weary body get dragged further into the apartment. He had half the mind to protest at the action before he was pushed onto the couch and heavily tucked in by blankets. Half of him wanted to just give in, to relax and let his mom take care of her helpless little Izuku. The other half was screaming at him, shouting no. I'm not helpless, Mom, I have a quirk now. I'm a hero. I'm a hero. I'm a. Poor baby boy, it must be so hard without mommy there to help you. She was muttering, fussing over how tightly tucked the blankets were. He opened his mouth to respond, but was quickly stopped. Her finger was pressed to his lips and she was making shushing noises now. Everything was so blurry he could barely even make out her face. He couldn't stop the slight whimper that left his lips. Kami, he felt so helpless. SHH baby, just relax for me. Be my good little Izuku okay? The familiar nickname was overshadowed by the now sickly sweet tone her voice had adapted. It was like she was speaking to a baby, not her 15-year-old son. Her 15-year-old, hero student son, with a quirk as strong as All Might's and a mind quick enough to keep ahead of his classmates. Panic overtook the teen. He felt vulnerable and scared. Like someone had sliced through his abdomen and exposed his organs to be seen by the world. That gentle prying that his mother used was pushed further until it was ripping his modesty away from him. It wasn't sleep that took the teen, sleep was peaceful, the body's rest. This was a forced shutdown, a sort of overload. His vision grayed out and his breathing slowed until it was barely a crawl. He'd never felt so dizzy, it was as if everything was spinning in all directions, he felt so fragile, so broken like this. His body's only reaction was to open his mouth and let his tongue loll out as words failed to form. There was no sleep, it was just his body trapped in a sort of lucid dream, the world tumbling and turning and graying out, while his body could do nothing to respond. At some point, his mother left his side. He wasn't sure whether he was more relieved or terrified at that thought. He had no idea how long he remained in that position, barely enough control to even blink his eyelids. There was a soft buzzing emanating from his side. His phone. Someone was calling him, repeatedly. He couldn't have forced his body to move, so he just sat there, feeling the phone buzz in frequent intervals, faintly remembering the rule Izawa-sensei had set to check in every hour either over text or with his communicator. It was a new system, a simple necklace Yaoi Rozu and Hatsum had created that hung around Izuku's neck. His classmates all had it on their person in some way. Jiru wore it as an ear piercing, and Shoji had it attached to the clip of his mask. Kachin begrudgingly wore it as a bracelet along with several other classmates, while Kaminari had it modified to replace his regular tongue piercing. It was a basic sort of communicator with a tracker built in that the teachers had access to at all times. Since Kachan's kidnapping, it seemed like the best way for Izawa-sensei to keep track of his problem class. There was enough willpower left in his head to push his hand out of the tucked-in blanket. He groped his own neck and chest, trying to find the small circular piece hanging around his neck. He found it and almost whimpered again at how sensitive he felt and how cold the air seemed as it touched his exposed neck. He pressed the button held in his stiff hand, but after that, he had no strength left, there was no more willpower available, and he felt his mind go sluggish and slow. His eyes shut within the next few moments, his heartbeat gradually growing slower and slower and slower and… When his heart gave way was the exact moment a knock on the door echoed through the apartment. Shouta was concerned, extremely concerned. Whenever one of his students had permission to go off of campus, he was always on edge. Namuri liked to joke that he was like a mother hen for his students, too overprotective, too untrusting. She clearly hadn't met a single one of the problem children, because if she had, she would know that none of them could be trusted to make dinner, let alone go out alone. Despite these feelings, he had allowed Midoriya the evening with his mother. He saw the toll the dorms were having on the kid, he was more on edge and seemed to be lacking sleep and a proper comfort zone. The kid looked to be in constant discomfort and Shouta could have sworn he'd heard the kid growl at another student. If he was taking after Bakugo, then they were all doomed. So when the overly emotional boy had brought the consent form to Shouta, asking to have dinner with his mom this Friday, hands shaking and lip quivering, Shouta couldn't bring himself to say no. Besides, he was meant to be back at the dorms by 8 and check in with Shouta every hour until then. There was no room for misdoings, and so far the boy had been diligent in keeping Shouta updated on his previous outings. Those, however, had been with the company of at least one of his classmates. Alone, Shouta was concerned that Midoriya wouldn't be able to avoid trouble. There was a reason he called him problem child after all. It had been an hour and a half since Midoriya's last text. He tried to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. He knew that he was paranoid and that teens were prone to forgetting. That fact unfortunately did not ease his anxiety. When the kid got back he'd give him a warning and maybe an extra exercise to really drive the point home. But there was a tug in his gut that told him something was wrong. That planted the question of if the boy would be coming back at all. That tug only strengthened when he got an alert from Midoriya's communicator. The communicators were a new installment, both a test for Hatsume and a failsafe for when his class inevitably got in trouble. They had a recording piece that when pressed, would record the audio of the next 10 seconds. Enough to get out any important information, but not too long as to hinder speed of transfer. It really was a brilliant invention. Using her quirk, Hatsume was able to work the circuit into such a small scale that the device itself was no larger than a penny, easily concealed and marvelously practical. When he listened to the recording sent from Midoriya's communicator, he heard nothing. He leaned closer to his speaker and turned the volume up to max. Well, it wasn't complete silence. The device had a wide range, so it was able to pick up the slightest sounds in a decent distance surrounding the device. He could hear breathing and the rustling of cloth and what sounded like plates clicking against each other. 7 seconds and a soft whimper took over the recording and Shouta immediately recognized it as his student. He jumped out of his chair and slammed his laptop shut before pulling up the tracking app on his phone, again an ingenious system created thanks to Mei Hatsume. Midoriya was hurt and it must have been bad if he couldn't send more than a whimper. That was saying something since the kid had a pain tolerance that was frankly terrifying. He wasn't one to complain and rarely made any sort of indication of the pain he was in. For the boy to whimper fuck he needed to go. And now. The boy's communicator was still at his mother's apartment, he could tell that from the app, his location had remained the same for the past hour and a half, according to the app's records. It wasn't far, only a 15-minute walk from UA. Still, a part of the hero's mind was already splitting. What if he wasn't fast enough? What if Midoriya was kidnapped? Why hadn't he left the moment Midoriya was late to check in? What if… No. He couldn't spiral, he had to focus. He was already out of the teacher's dorms and fully decked out in his hero gear by the time his mind had sharpened. He was now at UA's gates which were closed tightly, he scanned his pass and a red light flicked on. Hello, Azawa-kun. Where are you going at this time of night? You don't have patrol according to your schedule. It was Principal Nedzu's voice, it echoed through the tinny speaker about the place he scanned his pass. Despite the principal's wondering, the gate still began to open. Midoriya hasn't responded, I'm going to check on him. Oh well, I do hope the young boy is alright. Would you like me to contact the police, Azawa-kun? The hero pondered that for a moment, but the tugging in his gut increased and his face stretched into a grimace. I have a bad feeling about this, if my gut is wrong at least that should knock some sense into Midoriya. Either way, the police would be useful. With that, the hero took off without another word, satisfied that the rat had understood and trusted Shouta's gut. The hero quickly began running. On the ground he was fast, his stamina was top tier, and he was light on his feet. But it didn't feel fast enough. By the time he'd made his way to a more residential area it had already been 2 minutes. 2 minutes too long if he was to continue trusting his gut. He couldn't help but think back to the last time he had a feeling as bad as this. Surrounded by forest and seeing smoke rise above the trees in the distance. Smelling an oddly sweet odor. Leaving most of his students with the wild pussycats, heroes he trusted while he and Vlad continued with the extra lessons. That painful tug when he heard the first scream ring from the trees and finding problem child bruised, broken, and battered but still going. Gotta keep moving, faster. He threw out a loop of his capture scarf and used it to propel himself onto a nearby roof. He quickened his pace, this time roof hopping and using his capture scarf to propel him at higher speeds. This way he could skip the winding alleys this area of the city had as well as get a more bird's eye perspective on the situation. Not for the first time, Shouda found himself wishing he'd had a quirk like Hawk's. If he had, he would have been there by now, Midoriya would already be safe. If only he could have been faster then maybe he could have gotten him out of the way, maybe he wouldn't have seen his limp body between bits of rubble covered in blood and… Focus. He cut himself off. 5 minutes now and he caught a glimpse of the apartment complex Midoriya lived in. He'd never actually been inside as he'd left Yagi to speak with the Midoriyas regarding dorms, but he remembered the exterior well enough to recognize it in the dimming light. The tracker certainly helped to fulfill his assumption as it began to beep the closer he was to the teen's location. The final swing had him flying over the street and onto the street lamp on the other side. Gripping it tightly, he slid down the lamp like a fire pole and ran towards the teen's apartment. 209 209 209. Second floor. The kid's apartment building lacked any sort of main foyer, stairs led directly to each apartment door from the outside, upper floors being supported on decks that wrapped around a quarter of the building. He bolted up the steps, nearly flying over the last few with the momentum he'd created with his capture scarf. His pace didn't slow as he ran down the deck, scanning door numbers. Finally he slid to a harsh stop. His breaths came in heavy pants, sweat dripped down his brow. There was no window by the door he could see through, but a light through the crack indicated there was some kind of life inside. There was no obvious commotion. All also seemed quiet and calm in the apartments around 209, and 209 blended itself perfectly in with others. Nothing appeared to be wrong, so why was his gut still screaming at him to just go? He forced himself to take a shaky breath, then he smashed his fist against the door in a likely too aggressive knock. It was only a moment before the door was opened, a moment too long but still only a moment. A short plump woman with dark green hair and round emerald eyes stood in the open doorway. The resemblance was uncanny, the only thing Midoriya seemed to have inherited from someone else was his freckles and curly hair, as the woman in front of him had stick-straight hair and peachy skin without any beauty marks. She looked at the hero with wide eyes and for a moment Shouda almost felt guilty for scaring her, almost. "I'm Aizawa Shouda, your son's homeroom teacher at UA. I'm here to check on him," he said to the woman. It was best to keep this straight and simple without any fuss, he wanted to bring the young Midoriya back as soon as possible. "Oh well Izuku is fine sir," she stuttered out. "He's just taking a little nap right now," Inko Midoriya replied, gesturing inside to the couch where the teen seemed to be sprawled out on. The hero almost let out a relieved sigh, prepared to lecture the boy, then take him back to the dorms by the scruff of his neck if necessary. But his sigh caught in his throat as he looked at the boy, taking in his features. Hai watched how unusually relaxed the boy's body was, how devoid of tension and worst of all, how pale and dead he looked. His face was devoid of any expression, his tongue lolled out of his mouth and was turning a sickening purple hue. He almost choked on his own fear. He had half the mind to press his own emergency communicator as he sprinted, shoving Inko out of the way and grabbing the kid off of his own couch. The woman began to yell and protest, but Shouda ignored her completely. There was no response. His head snapped back at the movement and Shouda laid the kid as gently as he could onto the ground. He pressed an ear to the boy's chest, if he was breathing, then it was too faint to hear. He reached around the boy's neck, pushing soft green curls out of the way, seeking out his pulse and… nothing. Then he began CPR. 30 compressions, then 2 puffs of air into the boy. Then repeat, again and again and again and again and… Suddenly someone was trying to pull him away. He shoved them away, not letting a single thought drift away from the child beneath him, whose hair kept flickering from green to wispy blue in the hero's eyes. He felt ribs give way under him, he felt the cracking and snapping as he pushed and pushed and pushed out. He didn't know how long he did that, it could have been mere minutes or it could have been hours, it didn't matter how long he did it, he just needed to save the kid, he needed to save Midoriya, he needed to save Izuku. Needed to save his friend. He heard yelling around him, he faintly saw flashing lights. Someone tried to push him away again, but he didn't allow it, he wouldn't let go, and all the while he didn't stop. Later he would realize that the police must have showed up, ambulance in tow. They attempted to replace the hero with a paramedic but were vehemently refused and shoved away. A stretcher was slid under the young Midoriya and they were both carried to the ambulance, Shouda performing CPR the entire time. How he hadn't been conscious of the movement he didn't know. But it wasn't until he was literally forced off of Izuku that he realized his environment had changed from the teen's apartment to an ambulance. He tried to scramble back towards the teen, but was held back by someone much stronger than he was, actually it must have been multiple someones, because he distinctly felt more than one pair of hands restraining him. He watched as a nurse prepped a defibrillator. Clear. When called out, they pressed the electricity into the boy's chest, his body jolted and stuttered, but remained limp. 1, 2, 3 clear. The process was repeated again and again, the boy's body jolted with the shock, this time staying tense for longer. Then his form dropped once more. Shouda wasn't breathing. Turn up the intensity. Clear. The machine was pressed onto the boy's chest again, this time instead of just jolting, the electricity seemed to lick across the boy's skin. Rippling and flickering like when he used full cowling. A shock went through the teen's body, starting at his feet and rolling right up to his head, the teen's whole frame tensed and stuttered, position held for a moment, even after the defibrillator was removed. Hua. The boy inhaled violently, eyes flashing open as he gasped for air. Something squeezed out of Shouda's eyes, hot and wet and painfully forced out of his unused tear ducts. Izuku tried to sit up but sobbed in pain as he continued to gasp for breath. One of the nurses began to put away the machine, while another pushed the boy back into the bed. A third nurse stuck a needle in the teen's arm and began to set up an IV, while a fourth was touching Izuku's head. He was sliding his fingertips along his face, tracing the curves and allowing his hands to dip lower, continuing to trace invisible lines. He tilted Izuku's head to the side, then lifted his hands away for a moment, before placing them along the boy's stomach, he traced them upwards in strange fluid motions, then he flicked his finger, and Izuku began to gag. The bag was held in front of his mouth as the boy retched and puked his guts out, all the while tears streaming down his face in fat globules that stuck to his eyelashes and slipped off of his nose as he continued to puke. It was a wrecked sound as each gag was intercepted by sobs, and without time to breath, he was trying to gasp in between retches. Finally, the gagging eased. The puking had stopped, there were a few more violent and raw coughs before the bag was pulled away and taken by one of the nurses to an unknown location. The fourth nurse from before had taken position again at Izuku's head, tracing the invisible lines over his face and down to his chest. His hands pulled away, seemingly satisfied with whatever he had done. Izuku fully collapsed onto the bed, head in the same position that the nurse had left it in. Izuku was a mess, puke stained the sides of his mouth and tears streamed down from his eyes, while snot leaked out of his nose. He was shirtless as someone had cut it away when the defibrillator was brought out and the boy was shivering violently. Shouda watched his chest move with each breath he took, staying at the place where his heart was almost like if he stared hard enough he could will it so that it kept on beating. The teen was an absolute wreck, but he was alive and breathing and crying, and now he was looking at Shouda, his eyes as wide as saucers. Shouda stared back. Izuku was alive. He was okay. He hadn't realized he was still being held back until the hands released, he stood up and stumbled towards the teen before kneeling down right next to him. In a moment of weakness, he reached up and grabbed Izuku's hand. It was cold and clammy and almost dead before Izuku squeezed his hand back weakly. Someone knelt down beside him, closer to Izuku's head, but the erasure hero couldn't care less, his kid was alive and he just needed to make sure he stayed alive. The long skeletal-looking hand reached towards the teen's face holding a damp towel. As one of the man's hands came up to cup the teen's cheek, the other began to shakily clean off his face, wiping away puke, tears and snot, cleaning the boy's face with such gentle care that caused the boy to only cry more. The boy opened his mouth but was quickly hushed. Shouda recognized that these hands must have been some of the ones holding him back. "It's alright my boy." The voice of the man calmed as he continued to swipe the towel across the teen's face. Shouda looked over at the familiar voice to see none other than Yagi Toshinori, All Might, gently cleaning off his student's face as if he were the most precious thing in the world. The man's own expression was soft, more vulnerable than Shouda had ever seen it as he wiped another tear from Izuku's face. "Don't worry my boy, I am here." And despite hearing that phrase so many times from the number one hero, this time was far different. He didn't sound confident and it wasn't said loudly as to show the world. No, it was said directly to Izuku, a gentle reassurance, a common line altered to provide the comfort it needed. And it did provide the necessary comfort, as with those words, Izuku breathed deeply a few more times, eyes flashing between both of his teachers as he squeezed Shouda's hand. Then he shut his eyes and his body relaxed, all except for the hand holding Shauda's, which was still held tight. The hero felt his breaths begin to quicken and took the moment to check the boy's pulse from his wrist. He sighed in relief as this time, he could feel it as strongly as ever. The teen's heart was beating with the strength it should have had this entire night. The ambulance was quiet save for the shuffling of the paramedics and the beeping of equipment. Awoke-kun. Not now. Shauda interrupted Yagi. He took a shaky breath and let himself calm as the growing warmth of Izuku's hand reassured him. At the hospital. Just not now. The man seemed to understand as he didn't press any further, he simply reached over and began to pet softly at Izuku's head, his green curls bouncing back up after each pet. Shauda exhaled deeply again, then he inhaled, then let it out again. Izuku was alive, he was safe. Shauda had gotten there in time, he had been fast enough if only just barely. He mumbled, mostly to himself but loud enough so Yagi was able to hear, "Kami, what the fuck just happened?" Yagi seemed to sense that this was not a question he was meant to respond to, and so both the heroes sat and pondered quietly. What the fuck just happened? The rest of the ambulance ride went by as a blur. Izuku was passed out, hands still clutching Shauda's. At some point one of the nurses had laid a blanket over the teen, it was more like a thin flimsy sheet, but it was at least enough to allow the kid some dignity and a minute amount of warmth. There were 8 people inside the ambulance, including the sleeping teen and the 4 nurses. That left Shauda, Yagi, and Detective Tsukauchi, who was responsible for the other set of hands that were previously holding the erasure hero back. Despite Shauda's protests at Yagi's questioning, the detective pressed onwards with his own, notebook in hand, and a pensive expression on his face. They both went through the familiar motions of questioning. Tsukauchi asked basic questions first. When was the last message he received from Midoriya? What was the set curfew and agreement before the teen had left UA? He used his own device to record the conversation and asked Shauda to play the recording sent by Midoriya's own communicator. Shauda relayed what information he had, he described his journey to Midoriya's home and the bad feeling in his gut. He described the brief interaction with Midoriya's mother before he had seen the boy himself, then he relayed what the boy's condition had been and what his immediate reaction was. The detective took his words in stride, nodding along until Shauda's story was finished. When he was done with Shauda, he asked to speak with the nurse who was previously touching Midoriya. The man's quirk was called affliction. By tracing the body's major veins and arteries, he was able to determine what it was currently being afflicted with, and in certain situations, he was able to force the removal of the substance afflicting the victim. He stated that the teen had gone into cardiac arrest but was able to be brought back by CPR and use of a defibrillator. The cause of the issue was determined to be a drug overdose, taken orally. Shauda's heart shattered and he squeezed the kid's hand with renewed vigor. Yagi seemed to take the news just as well, he was gently petting Midoriya's head and staring at the boy with a look of heartbreak on his face. We aren't sure what the drug was that caused the cardiac arrest, however it seems the effects may have been negated once it was removed from his system. We'll test the contents of his stomach in the lab at the hospital. If you could send some of it to the police's lab as well, that would be appreciated. We aren't sure if there was any kind of foul play here or if this was self-inflicted. You could cut the tension in the room with a knife. No, Namasa. Young Midoriya would never do something like that. Yagi protested, jumping up from where he was seated. Yagi. Sit down. We won't know anything for sure until we can talk to the kid. Shauda stated. Despite how much it hurt to think Midoriya had done this to himself, it was a possibility that couldn't be ignored, both for his safety and everyone else's. It was odd though, Midoriya, while sometimes self-sacrificing, didn't seem like the type to do this. He was overall a happy kid, he wanted to be a hero, to help people, he would rather eat his own hand than inconvenience anyone, and fought every day to be better, to be stronger. To try to commit suicide, especially without any sort of note, is something he couldn't imagine from the teen. Eraserhead is right, Toshinori. Tsukauchi agreed. Yagi visibly staggered at this statement. However, that isn't the only option. I have men searching his apartment right now, and I'm planning on interrogating Mrs. Midoriya herself after I get the kid's statement. If I may interject, the nurse stepped forwards. Before anyone is to question Mr. Midoriya, we will be doing some tests to make sure there are no adverse side effects, and we will be wrapping and tending to his broken ribs. The nurse said, leaving no room for argument. Shauda grimaced slightly at the nurse's reminder of the harsh CPR he had been using on his student earlier. He could vividly remember the feeling of ribs cracking and snapping as he tried to bring his student back to life. He was alive though, that's all that mattered, his ribs would heal. Of course, Yagi questioned. Byasu nai. Ah yes, Byasu-san. Thank you. The former number 1 hero bowed, showing his gratitude to the man before him. He then sat back down by Midoriya as the ambulance lapsed into quiet once more. They were now pulling up to the hospital. Midoriya was carried on the stretcher out of the ambulance and towards the pediatric floor of the hospital. Shouta and Yagi were blessedly allowed to follow as they were both pro-heroes and also the boy's current legal guardians thanks to his residence in the dorms of UA. He was awake now, though still obviously groggy. The boy was yet to say anything and it only caused his teachers to grow more anxious with his silence. Midoriya had an odd look on his face, his eyebrows were pinched together and his gaze was pointed downwards. He barely reacted as the nurses went about their tests and began to wrap and treat his injured ribs. The kid remained deep in thought, imaginary gears turning within his mind. Suddenly, the teen's face twisted in disgust, he reached a hand up to his mouth as his jaw was wiggling around and adjusting itself. Young Midoriya. My boy, what is it? Yagi asked, far too loudly for the hospital late-night environment. My teeth. He had an intense lisp that confused the room, his mouth was moving around trying to adjust itself around words that seemed now unfamiliar. Open your mouth for me, lad. A nurse commanded as she approached the boy with a couple of tools. The teen complied, opening his mouth wide for the nurse. She began to hum to herself as she maneuvered her tools in the boy's mouth while shining a light inside. Odd, your gums are extremely inflamed especially around your canines, and your tongue appears to be enlarged or rather elongated. Does your quirk have any sort of mutation factor? The boy shook his head in response. Strange, could you stick your tongue out for me please? He did as she said, and even Shouta couldn't contain his shock at what he saw. Izuku's tongue stuck out far further than what was normal, like a significant amount further, there were odd bumps along the whole thing, and weirdest of all, the end appeared to be forked and lizard-like. Well lad, it appears you are beginning to develop some late mutations from your quirk. If I were to hazard a guess, I would assume the reason your gums are inflamed is because a new set of teeth are trying to come through. Nothing to be worried about, it's all a natural part of quirk growth. That shouldn't be possible. Shouta interjected, Midoriya's quirk isn't any kind of mutation, it's not even related. He has a strength quirk, nothing that should cause any mutations. It wasn't entirely unheard of for quirks to develop new features, but a mutation feature in superpower. That made no sense. HRMM. The nurse hummed, her own eyebrows pinching together. Izuku had closed his mouth by now, his tongue slithering back in with a strange flicking motion that seemed unfamiliar to even the teen. If anything, his questioning look was even stronger now. He was avoiding eye contact with both of his teachers and deemed instead to stare at his lap. I'd like to draw some blood to do a couple of tests. Midoriya nodded in response and Shouta gestured as well before slumping in his seat. Do whatever you need to. He responded, giving his consent. Midoriya, could you please try to explain yours and your parents' quirks to me while I do? She asked as she began to set up the blood drawing equipment. The boy shared a quick almost panicking look with Yagi, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod in response. Well my mom can attract small objects towards herself. And my dad can breathe no. It's okay kid, take your time. Shouta tried to reassure, seeing the kid's frustration with his new lisp. He took a breath before continuing, my dad can breath fire. I think that's all but I haven't met him so I don't know much else. The boy said, finally wrapping his new tongue around the th sound. And my quirk is called superpower. It gives me strength like All Might's, but I can't handle it all so at full power it makes my bones break. The nurse hummed in response again, a soothing sound that had Shouta unwillingly relax in his own chair. Well it's possible your father's quirk was slightly different than you were told or more complicated, you may be gaining these mutations from him. It's odd timing, but with quirks anything can be possible lad. The nurse asked as she pulled the needle out of the boy's arm and stood up with the blood. Why yeah. The teen responded. Despite his words, he looked far more dejected at the idea than one would have expected. For now you should rest. The results won't be in for at least a few hours. I understand that you both would like to stay with Midoriya, but please allow yourselves some rest as well. She all but commanded, making eye contact with both Yagi and Shouta. They both gave her a curt nod and she smiled slightly before leaving the three of them to their room. The first thing Tsukauchi's detectives found in their search was a special container on Inko's counter labeled Izuku's dinner. It had the leftover food she must have cooked that night for Izuku. The piece that made that strange was that there was another container with the exact same food inside labeled my food. The separate containers seemed suspicious, so they took both into the station for testing. Next his men searched the bathroom and Izuku's bedroom. The bathroom had nothing odd, only normal pain medication and some anti-anxiety meds with Inko's name on them. Izuku's room was also clean, it was mostly empty save for a few childish decorations. The second strange thing the detective found was in Inko's bedroom, under her bed. There was a box filled with strange metal bracelets, the box was labeled out of power and the bracelets were taken to the station. Also under the bed was a large black duffel bag, in said bag was an iPhone, and strangest of all, massive bags filled with various colored powders of various quantities. Each bag was labeled in a specific order, one was test batch 001 and another marker, the words 2 week were drawn onto the bag. This similar naming scheme was used for the various other bags of which there were 13 total. In the kitchen, the detectives found another bag labeled test batch 014 tucked under the cutting board in one of the drawers, this bag was mostly empty. All the bags were taken in for testing. The phone was fully charged and had an untraceable SIM card. Since the password was unknown, it would take a bit to get into the phone. However, without the code itself, they were still able to see the recently unseen notifications. They were from a number saved as Kai and were inquiring how the latest batch had worked and if she needed any more of the suppressant. Needless to say, the evidence didn't paint a pretty picture. While the substance in these bags was still unknown, it could be heavily assumed that Inko had drugged her son's dinner and may have been testing unknown drugs on her son for an extended period of time. Tsukauchi was beyond angry. He was furious and he was concerned. It was unknown how long this had been happening or even what drugs were used. Inko Midoriya must have gone too far with the dosage this time, possibly because she hadn't been able to give her son a consistent dose since he had come to the dorms. She'd gotten sloppy and with that sloppiness she risked her son's life. No, she didn't risk it, she killed him and he had to be brought back. While nothing was completely certain yet, with all the incriminating evidence it was almost impossible to assume anything else. He would wait for the results, keep Inko in custody until things were more clear and charges could actually be pressed. For now, he needed to get Izuku's statement without revealing the situation, he needed to know what the boy knew. He gave the teen about an hour to get settled and set up in his hospital room. Toshinori and Izawa waited with him, keeping a close eye on the teen. Tsukauchi had never seen the erasure hero so devastated as to when he had arrived at the Midoriya apartment, he hadn't been aware enough to recognize himself or Toshinori, even as they dragged the hero off of Izuku, so the paramedics could do their work. The two had arrived together as they were discussing the League of Villains when Tsukauchi got Nedzu's message. At the idea of his successor being in danger, Toshinori demanded he be taken along. At most they had worried the boy had been attacked in his home, that he was in the middle of a villain fight. Neither man expected to see the boy dead and engaged in CPR by his homeroom teacher. It had horrified them both beyond compare, even just thinking back on the previous hour, had the detective feeling sick to his stomach, especially with the new information he had acquired. He was being led to Izuku's room by a nurse who was informing him on the boy's condition and the new development that was presenting itself within the boy's mouth. While it was concerning and further enhanced the bad feeling in his gut, the boy was mostly alright and would make a full recovery within the next week. It was a reassurance that Tsukauchi was deeply grateful for. The teen's room was basic but private. It was a solo room on the third floor with a small square window that led out into the street. Izuku was sitting up in bed drinking water from a straw while Toshinori and Izawa were sitting in chairs on either side of the boy. Izawa seemed to have been feigning a nap before the door opened, while Toshinori had simply closed the book he had been glimpsing through. Hello Midoriya, he felt sick even saying that name, but this was not the time to be casual. I'm detective Tsukauchi and I'd like to ask you a few questions if that's alright. Why yeah of course sir. You're Fee the detective in charge of the love case right? The teen answered, his voice was slightly scratchy, but otherwise he seemed fine. There was a lisp in his voice however that the detective was certain hadn't been there before. Yes I am. He responded and pulled up the third and final chair in the room. He took great care to relax his posture and smiled at the heroes in the room. I'm going to be recording this conversation, is that alright with you Midoriya? Why yes. He nodded while speaking. Truth. Alright, to start, what is your full name and age? My name is Midoriya Izuku and I am 15 years old. Truth. Good start. Can you tell me what you remember about tonight? The boy's face fell for a moment before his eyes filled with determination once more. I had gotten to mom's at around 6:30 p.m, she hugged me and told me to sit down while she got dinner ready. Truth. So I sat down and she brought me tea and some cookies she had just finished baking. I ate quite a few of them and drank the tea and it was all perfect. I was starting to feel kind of dizzy and I thought I was just dehydrated so I went to go get some water. All true. The lisp seems to be diminishing a bit too, good. I went to the kitchen and mom got super surprised, she kind of hid what she was doing and ran over to me saying how I should be resting and stuff. Then she brought some lemonade and it was really good, but it kind of had a weird chalky taste at the bottom. It was still good though. She hid that's not a good sign. Still all true though. So were you still feeling dizzy at this point? He asked. Izuku seemed to stop and think for a moment. Yes. It was almost getting worse. But then dinner was ready and she made my favorite and it just smelled so good I pretty much stuffed my face, but when I was done I just felt worse. My mouth was really dry and everything tasted kind of chalky. Again I don't know. I tried to drink more tea, but it didn't help and I kind of started to panic. The kid almost looked guilty. Yet everything he said was true. I tried to stand up, but my legs were really wobbly and I had to hold on to mom. Things start to get a fuzzy here. I think I mentioned UA and she said something about how she would take care of me. My move felt like there was cotton stuffed in it and I was just so dizzy she brought me to the couch and like kind of tucked me in real tight and she just kept talking and saying weird stuff. What sort of things, kid? He interrupted. The kid let out a shaky sigh and wiped at his eyes which were beginning to well up with more tears. Like how I was her baby and how I didn't well need UA and she would take care of her baby boy, her little Izui. It was weird, she just seemed so wrong and I couldn't well move really and I couldn't say anything and I didn't know what to do. She left me Veer and I was just like stuck in my own head and I think I pressed my communicator but it was all so fuzzy and then it got fuzzier and then it was just dark and then I was in the ambulance and everything was so loud and sharp and it all hurt. Hey my boy, it's alright. Toshinori reassured as he gripped the teen's hand. Take a breath problem child, it's been a long night. Aizawa added, placing his own hand on the kid's shoulder. Both the heroes trying to ground the boy back in the present. The kid took in a shuddering breath, then winced at how it moved his ribs, he exhaled slowly and opened his eyes to look at the detective. I have one last question for you Midoriya and this one is a bit uncomfortable, but did you knowingly take any drugs tonight? No detective. He interrupted. The only drugs I've ever willingly taken were pain medication. True and true. Some of the tension in the room immediately eased as the three adults took a collective sigh of relief. Then the tension increased again exponentially at what the teen said next. It was my mom wasn't it, she drugged me didn't she? He looked up at Tsukauchi with wide saucers for eyes, both brimming with tears, and in that moment there was no way he could have lied to the teen in front of him, professionalism be damned. Yeah kid, we think she did. Izuku didn't know what to do. That was pretty much it. Everything was fucked, everything was wrong. It had only taken one night for his entire life to fall apart. He died. Izuku Midoriya had been legally dead for over 20 minutes before he was revived. And in truth, he still didn't feel all there. His ribs ached, the nurses had done their best to treat them, but there were no quirks on staff that could help and the best that could be done for now was the wrap all the way around his torso. Ordinarily he would have brushed it off, he'd been hurt worse after all been through worse. The idea stopped in its tracks as he recalled that no in fact this here was the worst. He had died. Not just broken his arms, not just quirk exhaustion. No, he died. His mom had killed him. His sweet kind, loving mother had killed him. He had never felt so dull. He should have been sobbing, he should have been broken, screaming and crying and yelling like Kachin did. He wanted to scream and sob and worst of all he wanted his mom. Fuck he was pathetic, she did this, she hurt him, and yet the only thing he wanted right now was to be wrapped in one of her hugs and just cry. Then she would make him hot cocoa and put on an All Might documentary and it would all be better. But instead he was dull and his emotions were warped. Everything felt tainted and he spent his waking moments trying to literally wrap his tongue around the situation. That was something else that was new and just wrong. His gums ached and his tongue didn't seem to fit in his mouth like it did before. The toothaches weren't new, he'd been having frequent toothaches his entire life, no matter how well he took care of his teeth. They tended to get worse when he spent time away from home and his mother attributed them to stress. In fact, a lot of weird things always seemed to happen when he was away from mom. The more he thought about it, the more he remembered odd things from his childhood. Toothaches, dry mouth and dry skin that disappeared after dinner but showed up the next few days. Nails that seemed to grow too fast despite how often he cut and chewed at them. Growth spurts that never came and a frequent sore throat that seemed to get worse the older he got yet came in short bursts that never left him truly sick. He remembered the bracelets he used to wear, they were ugly and uncomfortable, but mom said they were a gift from his uncle, so he felt he had to wear them. They were supposed to protect him, that's what she said. He remembered the last time he wore one was his second year of middle school when Kachin had destroyed it during gym class and his mother lectured him for hours on how he needed to stay out of the blonde's way. How she needed to make sure her little Aizu stayed safe. The longer he thought, the more unnerved and violated he felt. Every memory tainted with that strange chalkiness and sickly sweet care. He vaguely registered All Might Yagi-san his mentor trying to speak with him, but the words fell on deaf ears. He felt bad for being so out of it, for ignoring All Might, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything about that guilt. Eventually the hero must have stopped talking because the room was now quiet. The detective had left several hours ago now and Izuku was left alone with his teachers as the moonlight shone through the window. He met Izawa's eyes and saw a flash of the grief he'd seen when he'd first awoken, no, not awoken, been revived. Because Izawa was the one who had saved him. The details were fuzzy, but his was the first face Izuku saw when he woke up and he had never seen the man so broken. His eyes were wild and red, not like when he was using his quirk, like he had been crying. The strength in which he held Izuku's hand grounded him and the gentle squeezes kept reminding him that only moments before he wasn't able to squeeze back. In short, he never wanted to see his teacher like that again. Now the man was lying on the small visitor's couch, he was curled up slightly and watching the teen with careful considering eyes. His sensei showed so little emotion in most of his face. Most of the time, his expressions could basically be written off as negligible. His eyes though, told a whole different story. Izuku wasn't sure if the hero knew how much emotion his eyes displayed or even if Izuku himself was just proficient at reading them, however it was a welcome reassurance seeing the man did, in fact, have feelings. Yagi staying behind was less of a shock. His reactions however, left Izuku reeling in confusion. Izuku was still getting used to calling the hero anything other than All Might, the casual position he held with the hero, remaining an odd thing to wrap his head around, even after over a year of knowing him. Yet his eyes were so gentle when he'd woken up, he deemed to use the term waking up rather than further try to imagine his literal revival. He'd never seen that look on his face before. He'd never seen the man do something so soft as to clean Izuku's face, making sure to dry his tears and keep him tethered. As if he were to float away if he didn't. Now the former number one was sitting hunched in the chair on Izuku's left. It was a strangely familiar position with how often the boy was hospitalized, however this time felt far more serious than any other. He felt that this time would forever affect any time in the future because he knew there would be more, he was training to be a hero, and heroes got injured. Something he'd tried valiantly to explain to his mother on his previous hospital visits, her worries smothering him, scaring him into thinking she would remove him from UA altogether. Yes, the more he thought about his mother, the more worrisome situations kept presenting themselves in his memory, as if serving up evidence of his odd life on a platter for all to see. More than anything else that Izuku had felt tonight, he was tired. Both physically and emotionally, he had been completely drained. Yet he tried his best to avoid sleep. He didn't want to drift off again, didn't want the world to go cold and black. He didn't want to die and sleep seemed far too close to death. Izawa seemed to notice his internal conflict. The hero sat up and walked over to Izuku with sad eyes but an otherwise blank expression. Izuku stared right back, he felt his eyes droop slightly but he fought against them, fighting to hold eye contact with the hero. He was alive, he needed to show the man that he didn't need to worry any longer. The man sighed and broke eye contact. He slumped down into the chair on the right of Izuku. "Problem child, I won't tell you what to do, but your body needs rest. It needs to recover. Everything else can wait until then." His words sounded loud and clear in the otherwise quiet room. He knew his teacher was right, but I can't. The teen shuddered, feeling pathetic at the admittance. All Might took the moment to clear his throat, gaining Izuku's attention. Young Izuku, the boy hitched a breath. Yagi leaned over and placed hand on Izuku's shoulder. He paused for a moment, seemingly lost in thought before meeting his successor's eyes. "It is not death, my boy." The word struck a heavy chord deep within the teen. The note of understanding must have hit Izawa as well. "He's right, kid, sleep isn't death. It's different." The man echoed Yagi's point. Silence for a moment, Izuku's brain devoid of thought, just floaty fears and frozen limbs. "It's just so cold." He must have said that aloud because he felt as another blanket was draped over him, he looked up and saw Yagi giving him a bright but soft smile. It wasn't just another flimsy hospital sheet, it was a fluffy red, blue and yellow blanket that the former hero pulled out of his bag. Immediately he began to feel warmer. Then he let out a soft oof as another piece of fabric was thrust at him, he grabbed it and examined the plush black sweater that smelled slightly of coffee and cologne. Looking up, he saw that Izawa-sensei was now sitting with just a tank top, the bottom half of his costume, and his capture scarf of course. He gestured at Izuku, "Put it on, it should help." He almost started sobbing on the spot. He put on the sweater and instantly the warmth and scent filled him with calm and contentment. He looked between his two heroes, between his two teachers. The two men showed no sign that they were leaving anytime soon, and at the thought, he relaxed even further. The idea of being alone and cold scared him, but being warm and watched by his two favorite heroes, that was more than enough. As he cozied up in the warm and let a small sigh escape him, he let his eyelids fall without fear of whether or not they would open again. After the teen fell asleep, the two heroes began to relax when he heard soft snores emanating from the boy. The tension came back almost instantly however when a soft knock resounded against the door. The more the detective learned about the Midoriya family, the deeper his worries became. "Tsukauchi, the bracelets are like the cuffs we use to subdue criminals," stated Sansa, the cat-quirked officer and one of Tsukauchi's most trusted men. You could almost hear the pin drop. "They are quirk-suppressant cuffs, sir." Tsukauchi felt his body tighten, his breath hitching in his throat. He forced himself to relax and bring the phone back up to his ear. "And the powders?" he asked. "A rudimentary drug, all with the same base. It became more and more refined with each batch. Though we've never seen this exact drug in this form, it seems that this is a powdered form of a powerful quirk-suppressant drug that's been circling the underworld." The detective began to pace the length of the room he was in. It was an empty office on the ground floor of the hospital that he'd used several times before. He was alone in the office while he waited to hear back from the precinct or the hospital lab. The precinct called first and thus explained the phone call he was currently on with Sansa. The cat-quirked officer was overseeing the police precinct's testing of the substances found in Midoriya's home and his stomach, while the hospital was testing the teen's blood and his stomach contents as well. So far, the hospital had been unable to give any information. The precinct, however, was quick with its work and had specialized procedures for events such as these. It certainly helped that the victim in question was a hero student involved with the LOVS attacks and also a person of interest due to his connections with All Might and by association Tsukauchi. It was overall quite easy to expedite the process of investigation and by extension, lab testing. Furthermore, we found traces of the same drug in the contents of Midoriya's stomach and the food labeled as his dinner. This is undoubtedly the drug that was used on Midoriya. Although the detective had already suspected this was the case, it didn't make the news any easier to hear. A parent drugging their child was one thing, a parent using quirk suppressants on their child was another, a parent using a fatal dosage of the drug and causing their child to go into cardiac arrest and almost die was another that even for an experienced detective was difficult to hear. Especially when the child in question was the successor of one of his dearest friends. Finally, since this is the largest batch of the drug we've been able to uncover, we were able to test more of its properties. We found that there are large traces of human blood inside the makeup of the drug. Whoever made this is using someone's blood, likely their quirk for the result. Sansa continued, each sentence adding more and more horror to the situation. "And the phone, were you able to get any information from the burner?" Sansa let out a disgruntled sigh before answering. "We still haven't made it into the phone, however it has received several more messages from the number labeled as Kai. They are continuing to inquire about the drug and are now beginning to worry about Inko's lack of response." They used her name directly. "Fuck. Sir? What should we do?" There was a long pause. "The start, we are going to give the phone to someone with a hacking quirk. I know someone at a nearby precinct. While you are doing that, I'm going to make some calls and talk to Eraserhead." He responded, still thinking. "Also send a copy of Izuku's and his parents' quirk registration files to me and any other personal or legal information on any of them we have in our system." "Yes sir, I'll inform the team." "No Sansa," the officer made a confused grunt, "keep it to a smaller group. We need to keep information as close-knit as possible at the moment." "Of course sir," Sansa answered after a pause. "What's going to happen to the kid now that the suppressants are gone? His quirk was already strong with him." "I'm not sure Sansa." The detective responded, and that was partially true. However, he figured that one for all wasn't the quirk they would have to worry about here. Whatever quirk Inko had been suppressing in her son, he was certain it was not one he had inherited from All Might. Izuku Midoriya had a quirk and it was only a matter of time before they found out what it was. Quirk suppressants. You have got to be fucking kidding me. But Namasa. That's impossible. Both of you shut up right now. The heroes obediently listened to the detective, each feeling the stark shiver run down their spine as his usually calm voice raised to interrupt them. After his phone call with Sansa, the detective decided to inform Izawa and Toshinori on what little information he possessed. It was needless to say that neither hero took it well. Izuku was still asleep in his hospital bed, so the three men conversed in the previously unoccupied office where the detective was set up. It was good they had vacated the room as the rising volume and stress from the three men would have easily disrupted Izuku's slumber. The detective took a deep calming breath, pinching his brow between his fingers. "Toshinori. You and I both know why this situation is less than ideal." Toshinori began to protest, "Not now my friend." "Yes now." He snapped at the former number one. Then he sighed, allowing his tone to soften ever so slightly as Awa found the kitty saved him. "I don't know about you, but I can't imagine anyone more trustworthy to tell than his teacher." "Tell me what?" The room seemed to drop several degrees in temperature at Izawa's voice, cold and sharp. The erasure hero turned to face the retired hero, his eyes flashing red indiscriminately. "Did you know about this Yagi?" The man in question coughed in surprise, blood spewing out of his mouth. "No Izawa." I had no clue about young Midoriya, young Izuku's mother. This is just what Naomasa is referring to. It's his quirk, erasure. I'm talking about his quirk. If Tsukauchi had been a more well-rested man, he may have felt some semblance of guilt at the betrayed look Toshinori shot him. Despite this look, the detective continued, the quirk suppressants worked, just not on One for All. That woman was suppressing Izuku's original quirk. He stated. He was fighting hard not to keep his fists clenched as the simmering rage continued to rise within him. What the hell do you mean by original quirk? Aizawa fumed, you had better start explaining right now or I swear you won't live to see the outside of this hospital. The hero threatened the skeletal-looking man. The threat hung heavy in the air, the weight behind his words clinging to the tension and dragging it downwards further. Tsukauchi wasn't shocked to see his friend cower under Aizawa's harsh glare, any less brave man would have run away screaming moments ago. Toshinori faltered for a moment before speaking, then he sighed and rubbed at his head as if it was beginning to hurt. One for All is my quirk, or rather it was, that quirk now lies in the veins of young Izuku. Aizawa's eye began to twitch erratically and the room dropped another few degrees. Keep talking. Well, I suppose I'd better start from the beginning, Toshinori sighed. One for All is a unique quirk in that it is able to be passed on from one user to the next. It's the brother quirk of another, which is the ability to take and give away quirks as the user pleases. Many years ago, not long after quirks began appearing, two brothers had these quirks. The older brother was a notorious villain using his power to force the loyalties of thousands. All for one. Aizawa interjected and Toshinori began nodding solemnly. Yes. His younger brother opposed his villainous ways, it was believed that he was quirkless and he was constantly sick and weak. All for One became angry and bitter that his brother would not join him, so in a final desperate attempt for his loyalty or possibly to kill him, All for One forced a stockpiling quirk onto his brother. He paused for a moment and Tsukauchi continued where he stopped. That allowed the younger brother's previously dormant quirk to become known. The two quirks merged into One for All and have been passed down in generations since. Each user strengthened the power and handed it off to the next until it was hopefully strong enough to defeat All for One for good. As the detective finished, he could see the gears whirring in Aizawa's head. I am the 8th user of this power, Toshinori started again. I believed that I had defeated All for One 6 years ago, I only found out recently that that was not the case. The room was silent for far too long. Then Tsukauchi heard a sharp intake of breath as Aizawa began to speak. So Izuku is the 9th holder of One for All. A quirk you gave to a child when you knew it came with the baggage of possibly the world's oldest and most dangerous villain attached to it. Were you even thinking about Izuku, Yagi? The blame hung heavy in the air, the very molecules surrounding the homeroom teacher seemed to freeze at the icy glare he shot at Toshinori. Of course I was thinking of him. Toshinori shouted, his voice cracking slightly, All for One killed my mentor and almost every other user before her, he murdered them in cold blood. And my power was fading, I needed a successor, and when I met Midoriya Izuku, a quirkless little boy with the heart of a hero. Quirkless? I knew that it had to be him. I never would have given it had I known All for One had been alive. I would never have put young Izuku into that position. Yet you did. Aizawa shouted now. He began to pace, breathing heavily and grabbing his own hair in strangled gasps. When he looked up at the two men, the hero looked manic with rage. Fucking hell, is that why he was breaking his bones at the beginning of the year? Why didn't you teach him how to use it if it was your fucking quirk, or even tell me? I'm his teacher. I could have helped. Izuku didn't take to it like I did. And we couldn't tell anyone but a select few for the safety of everyone. Toshinori protested, defending himself and his successor immediately, and he has made tremendous progress since I gave the quirk for the entrance exam, so there is no need to. You gave it on the day of the entrance exam. You fucking buffoon, does that mean that was his first time ever using his quirk? Yes, I mean, well, I couldn't have given it earlier if I had. There was a chance his limbs would have gone flying off from the power until he had enough muscle mass. Flying off? I cannot believe someone society is supposed to admire could be so absolutely stupid. Both of you shut up. The detective yelled. The argument ceased almost immediately, both men panting like they had just been in a fight. Aizawa's eyes were bloodshot and his hair was frizzy and knotted. Toshinori's skin had a thin sheen of sweat across it and he was clutching at his injury. He watched as a small drop of blood dripped out of the hero's mouth. Aizawa, you can yell at Toshinori later. For now there are more important things to worry about, like what quirk was being suppressed. You could see the dawning realization on the pro and former pro's faces, both more akin to horror than anything else. This prompted the detective to continue his concerned musings. Contrary to what we believed, Izuku Midoriya was not quirkless before he received One for All, his quirk was just being suppressed. We have no idea what it may be and how it may manifest or interact with One for All. He made shaky eye contact with Aizawa as the man's eyebrows furrowed. Shit, it'll be like a kid getting their quirk for the first time except on steroids. Aizawa ran his hands through his hair with a grimace. And whatever quirk it is will have been strengthened by one for all as well. Toshinori added, his face growing more and more pale. Yes, to both of those things. He agreed, based on what the doctors told him about his tongue and tooth pain, his quirk is going to have some kind of mutation factor, but we don't know how far those mutations will go, especially since his mother's quirk is nothing like it. The unasked question hung in the room, waiting to be grabbed by one of the three men. Toshinori, ever the brave one, was the man to grab onto it. My boy did mention that his father had a fire-breathing quirk, but as far as I know he's never met the man and his mother told me he lives in America. All of that could be lies as well considering what we know about Inko. Aizawa cut in, clearly she never wanted Midori Izuku to develop a quirk in the first place, it's possible she didn't want anything tying the kid to his father. It's also possible that she was trying to hide Izuku's existence. If it's a showy mutation quirk that was starting to develop, it's likely the similarities to his father will be stark. That was exactly what I was worried about, Aizawa. He cut the hero off as he began to mutter. However, I've been looking through our records of his father, Hisashi Midoriya, and the man doesn't seem to exist. He's not on the kid's birth certificate and the only mention of him or his quirk are from Izuku's files. So Izuku's father is some sort of villain that was able to hide all traces of his existence, maybe someone Inko was hiding from. Aizawa concluded. Or the identity we have is completely incorrect and his father doesn't even know he exists. Toshinori continued where the hero paused. The only way to know for certain is to talk to Inko. Tsukauchi interrupted. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She's currently being held at the station. If we want any answers, we are going to need to talk to her first and foremost. Both the heroes nodded in agreement, a silent camaraderie forming between them. Hopefully she'll be willing to talk before Izuku shows any more signs of his quirk. If she isn't talking to you, I wouldn't mind taking a crack at the questioning. I'm a tad rusty, but I've been told I can be very persuasive. Aizawa offered. A joyless smirk crossed his features, more a show of teeth than a real smile. Toshinori looked momentarily scandalized, then his face dropped to something more dismissed. As much as I despise the use of such violent tactics, I loathe the idea of what that woman kept from my boy even more. I wouldn't mind bending a few rules myself. He admitted to the two men. The looming threat of violence filled the air again, this time however, it was all targeted at the same source. The opening of the office door was both a shock and a breath of fresh air to Shouta. It wasn't that he despised the company he was with, it was that the tension had become unbearable and the steel grip he held on his emotions was beginning to falter. He wasn't an emotional man, he prided himself on his willpower, yet tonight was far too much for him and his dry, aching eyes. The nurse had a pensive look on her face as she entered the office. She was holding a clipboard that had several official hospital forms stuck to it. My apologies for the interruption, sirs, however I must discuss the results of Izuku's blood test with the boy's legal guardian. She asked, her eyes darting between the three of them. But the sigh, Shouta stepped forwards, for now, that would be me. I'm his homeroom teacher and current legal guardian at UA. What did you find? The nurse nodded and stepped further into the room, closing the door behind her. Majority of the results are well within the regular range. Shouta heard a sigh of relief escape Yagi. Excluding tonight, the boy is extremely healthy with no obvious underlying issues. However, she paused and the tension increased tenfold. His blood dose appeared to have some clotting properties that are commonly seen in cold-blooded mutation quirks. Shouta couldn't help the confusion that must have been showing on his face. Currently, his body is struggling to regulate its temperature and we found that he needs to run at much higher heats than what is usually considered average. In short, he's way too cold. We gave him some extra blankets and raised the heat in his room. Until his full mutations come in or he is able to self-regulate again, his temperature needs to be kept an eye on. Shouta forced his face back to its usually bored expression as the nurse finished. Tsukauchi stepped up beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Is there anything else you can tell us about the boy's quirk? The detective asked. At this moment, there isn't much else we know. Frustrating, but unsurprising. His past medical files are old and formatted sloppily. It's obvious to us that his previous quirkless diagnosis was forged as we found no vestigial traits on his body except for the second toe joint. Usually, a quirkless individual would also have an appendix or gallbladder. Without one of these vestigial organs, any real doctor would have lost their license if they diagnosed him as quirkless. Ah, lovely, more reason to despise Izuku's mother. Falsifying quirk documents is a hefty crime. Her list of crimes is getting longer by the minute. I swear if I even see that woman again He interrupted his thoughts with a pinch to his wrist. Thank you Akagi-san, he said, how long until he can be discharged? The nurse smiled at him gently, he can be discharged tomorrow morning. His heart is in fine working order and there seems to be no damage actually caused. Thanks to the CPR performed on the scene, there was no brain damage due to an extended lack of oxygen. With all the drugs out of his system, he should be safe to recover his broken ribs outside of the hospital. It was as if someone opened a window and allowed a gust of fresh air to hit the hero. He was okay, Izuku was okay and he was safe. At the thought, he felt the adrenaline high he'd been riding finally fade. The heavy exhaustion that came afterward had him stumbling momentarily. Fucking hell, he's alright. Good. I need a nap. I'm going to sit with the problem child, whatever else needs to happen can happen in the morning or without me. He gestured roughly towards the detective and former hero before stepping towards the door. He paused for a moment as he stood in the doorway, if anything happens, you know where to find me. The hero added, before leaving the room with a start, ignoring the responses both men gave to his leave. He knew it was sudden, and he knew there was more that needed to be talked about. But at the moment, he couldn't care less. He wanted to take a nap where he could still hear his kid breathing, and he wanted to try and forget the image of the teen's limp-cold body that was engraved into his mind. More than that, he just needed some space from the two men. Yagi was alright to be around, if not awkward. And usually, as Awa would describe himself as a comfortable acquaintances with Tsukauchi. The vulnerable state he was forced into around the two tonight was not something he was comfortable with. He couldn't stand the thought of explaining himself to either of them, and he doubted he'd be able to look at Yagi for much longer without punching him in the face. So he did what he did best and left the uncomfortable social situation with practiced grace. The walk to the elevator was short and the ride itself was quick, if not annoying, due to the music playing. The walk from the elevator to Izuku's room was a short one as well. He pushed open the door as quietly as he could, thankful the hinges were well oiled and slick as he tried to make his presence unknown. Then as soon as he could see inside, Shouta froze. Standing over Izuku's bed, easily 7 feet of heavy muscles and shiny black scales, was a man Shouta had never seen before. A thick black tail hung down from the man's lower back, easily as wide as Shouta and almost as tall. It swayed slightly, then thumped against the tiled floor. The most dangerous part of this entire situation was that the man was holding Izuku. The teen was slotted in the Titan's arms, the blanket Yagi gave him earlier clinging to his shoulders. He looked so small, like the child he was, the way the man was holding him like a toddler didn't help the image. Shouta flashed his quirk almost instantly, readying his capture scarf with practiced ease as he hissed, "Put my student down. Right. Now." The Titan turned around to face Shouta and his mouth stretched in a toothy grin. He had large brown eyes and his face was covered in freckles, he had black curly hair with 2 horns popping out the top. His teeth were sharp and his canines extended downwards farther than they should have. He looked dangerous, yet there was an odd sort of familiarity about his face that Shouta couldn't place. Racerhead, it's amazing to meet you. I apologize for the surprise, you see I'm an underground hero as well, and I've always admired your work. Do you think you could sign something for me, or maybe we could do a team up? His voice was deep, but had a strange amount of excitement in it as the man began to ramble. Who the hell are you? He looked almost sheepish at the question, but paused as the teen began to murmur in his arms. SHHH little spark, it's okay, I'm here now, he muttered, almost reassuring the teen. Izuku seemed to melt at the words and began to cling more to the man. Shouta felt his quirk falter for a moment, the kid looked so soft and relaxed in the man's arms, he looked so young. Who are you and why do you have my student? The hero asked again, not bothering to hide the anger in his tone. Again Racerhead, I'm very sorry. I'll explain everything in a moment, but please keep your voice down, Izuku needs his rest. The Titan begged, shooting a worried look at the teen before raising a clawed hand. His hands are completely scaled and gently scratching Izuku's head. Again, the teen melted into the touch with a soft hum of contentness. Who are you? Shouta demanded. The man's smile softened and his posture straightened. He grabbed a leather wallet from his pocket with his free hand and held it out and opened to Shouta. In the wallet, clear as day, was a perfectly normal-looking hero license with a man's face captured in image form attached to it. You may know me as the Black Dragon. Shouta reached forward and took the wallet with doubtful hands, however right now, I'm here as Hisashi Kurai, Izuku's father. The more he looked, the more he noticed the similarities. First, it was in the hair, dark and curly and untamable. Then the freckles, a galaxy of them dotted across both their faces. Then the smile, the way the man's eyes crinkled in the same way Izuku's did, and the awkward hand that clutched the back of his neck when he began to mumble. He must have stood there staring for an uncomfortable amount of time, but the man didn't seem bothered. In fact, his eyes were tracing over Shouta in the same way, searching pupils that darted from his eyes to his hair, then to his scarf. They traced his arms and stalked down the rest of his body, scanning for threats, for weaknesses. Those were the eyes of a man assessing danger. A man with a well-practiced response to the unknown. Their eyes met and neither man backed down. Shouda had heard rumors of a hero from America on the underground scene, a man covered in black scales who spit flames and stalked the night skies. The name was a tad on the nose, but he wasn't one to complain when his own hero name was Eraserhead. Maybe it was the high emotion of the night, maybe it was the resemblance to Izuku, or maybe it was just his exhaustion taking over, but there was no pull of danger in his gut, no voice in his head screaming at him to run. There was just quiet confusion. He sighed and dragged a hand over his face, rubbing his pained eyes. Just put him back down, please. Or sit with him, I don't really care what, but you aren't taking him out of this room. The man obliged his commands and sat down on the hospital bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. He still held onto the teen, however it was obvious there was no intention to trap Izuku. In fact, it seemed more like the dragon man himself was being trapped by his student. He had one arm wrapped around the teen's thighs, hiking him up on his hip, while Izuku's arms were wrapped around his neck in a vice-like grip. The teen stirred at the sudden movement and Shouda saw as his eyes began to flicker open, small groans escaping him as he was coaxed into consciousness. The warmth enveloping Izuku was comfortable. He could feel the soft blankets draped over him and where his skin met air, he was pleasantly surprised to find it was not the regular freezing cold of his room, but a comfortable warm temperature as well. He noticed the slight pull of the wrap around his waist and the odd but not unfamiliar scent of his environment. He wasn't lying down anymore, he was sitting up and crouched up against something warm and firm. He was lulled into consciousness by the slight movements of the thing he was clutching onto, rhythmic movements that matched up with his own heartbeat and breathing. The scent was unfamiliar but not entirely new. The thing smelled slightly smoky and faintly cinnamon-esque, it was a calming aroma and he couldn't help but lean further into it. This thing felt familiar, it felt like his. There was a connection made in his mind that he couldn't quite place yet it filled an empty spot he hadn't realized was there. Whatever this thing was, he was faintly aware that it was his and he was its. Like they were one and the same. He felt the thing beneath him grow slightly, then fall again. I was worried you didn't smell right, but it is you, isn't it, Lil Spark? A voice asked. The man's voice was like a soothing balm to his conscious mind and he hummed in agreement with whatever was being said. He growled slightly as he felt the soft rumbling grow beneath him. Then he relaxed into it as he realized that more warmth seemed to be radiating from the source of the soft rumbles. Ah, that's my little dragon alright. I need you to wake up now Zuku, we need to do some talking with one of your adults here. He whined at the thought and his whine only grew as something began to tug him off of the warmth. SHH, easy now kid. The voice reassured and Izuku felt something scratch at his scalp in a circular motion. The feeling made him melt and forced a low grumble out of his throat. His arms loosened and he was pulled off of the warmth with gentle but firm hands. He peeled his eyes open lazily and was greeted by the sight of Izawa-sensei sitting on a firm cushioned chair in front of him. The man's eyes were trained on him but kept flicking upwards and behind Izuku. His mind was moving slowly, everything felt groggy, but the wariness on his teacher's face helped spark his brain awake. He blinked, deliberate and slow before following the man's gaze up and behind Izuku's shoulder. He was greeted by the face of an unfamiliar man, way closer to him than what was expected. The first thing he noticed was the man's hair, unruly and curled up in a haircut much like Izuku's own. The black curls framing the man's face and hanging just above his brows. Next were the freckles, there were a whole galaxy of them dotted across the man's cheeks of various sizes and splatters. The sun decorating him with souvenirs of their time spent beneath it. Finally, he noticed the closeness of himself to the man and the fact that he seemed to radiate heat directly onto the spots where Izuku's body was touching him. Since he appeared to be sitting on the man's lap, this was happening a lot. His brain short-circuited and Izuku heard himself make an extremely pathetic squeaking noise that would have had left Kachin with way too much blackmail. He practically leapt out of the man's lap. Which appeared to have been a terrible idea as he could have sworn he heard his ribs literally creak at the motion. Another pitiful nose escaped him, this time more whiny as he grabbed his midsection. He stumped backwards on his numb legs as they buckled slightly under him. He almost tripped over a long black appendage that was draped across the ground. Actually, screw almost, his heel caught on the appendage and he would have fallen if not for the perpetrator of the tripping flying upwards to support his waist and prevent the further crumbling of his already damaged dignity. Shit kid you're fast, the man chuckled. But the sound, the black appendage which Izuku now realized was attached to the man as a scaly tail, had unraveled itself from Izuku and was retreating back to a comfortable rest on the floor. Izuku took another step back, only to find himself stopped by a large hand on his shoulder. He flinched momentarily, but eased when he glanced back and saw his teacher's face. Izawa-sensei had a glare etched into his features, one that was aimed directly at the mysterious man. Izuku found it odd that despite Izawa's apparent distrust of the man, he remained quiet and mostly calm, while Izuku had literally been in his lap. "Gurai, that's enough." his sensei said. Despite his body radiating exhaustion, his eyes glinted with something fierce as he gripped Izuku's shoulder. He could feel the wires crossing in his brain as he tried to make any sort of connection between his sensei and the strange man in his room. He felt a slight squeeze on his shoulder and glanced up to meet Izawa's eyes, his face carrying a slightly different expression that Izuku couldn't place. "You alright, problem child?" His eyebrows furrowed at the question. Instead of answering immediately, he leaned a little further into his teacher's touch. It wasn't nearly as warm as the other man, but the warmth was nice nonetheless and had him subconsciously seeking more. He let out a soft hum of contentment that came up deep from his throat. It seemed to warm his body further, and Izawa tilted his head in what Izuku assumed was confusion at the sound. "I'm fine, sensei. Just tired." He could have sworn Izawa's lips twitched upwards with his words, but with how quickly his expression flattened, it could have been a trick of the light. "Izuku, do you know this man?" Izawa asked, suddenly disrupting the almost soft moment they had shared. The question startled Izuku out of this comfort. He looked at the man again. He was staring at Izuku with large brown eyes, and his eyebrows pinched slightly. The man was massive, easily pushing the height of 7 feet, and with a thick frame of muscle that only made him larger. He had a long black and scaled tail that was easily 5 feet long and had other patches of black scales along his extremities and weaker areas like his neck and poking out across his collar. His hands and feet curled in claws that were also scaled and stretched much larger than someone's would without a quirk modifying them. Even with his mouth closed, Izuku could see the tips of canine teeth poking over his bottom lip and took notice of the 2 piercings over his bottom lip as well. Snake bites, they were called if he remembered correctly. The man's ears were also black and scaled, stretching back farther than any ordinary human ear and flicking seemingly randomly around the room, mostly towards the outside of the door. Izuku began to wonder if the man had an increased sense of hearing, and if so how it worked compared to the ears of Shoji or Jiru. Knowing quirks however, it was likely the hearing was more akin to Hawk's slightly increased senses due to his body's mutation. As the man heaved out an exhale, a puff of smoke came out of his nostrils. Izuku's eyes widened. Fire breathing. He wondered if that was why the man was so warm, if the fire was somehow stored inside of him, or if it was a flammable fluid his body produced paired with some sort of activation spark in his mouth. Except no, it couldn't be that because then he wouldn't be able to puff out smoke like that, maybe it was created in his throat. If so then it would have avenues out of his nose and mouth. That must mean that he was somewhat fire resistant as well, especially around his face. He wondered if it affected his breathing or his sense of smell. It would be difficult to have enhanced smell when you were so often exposed to smoke, unless there was some sort of predetermined fail-safe that blinded his body to the smell of his own flames. Did it act as an exhale? If so, was it related to the body's lung composition? If the lungs were quirk modified that could cause some other issues, so maybe it was a different organ entirely that produced the flame. The man's face morphed into one of shock, then he smiled widely, his lips stretching to show his oversized grin. Izuku got a better look at his canines and found that the rest of the man's teeth seemed to be sharper and longer as well, indicating possibly a mostly carnivorous diet. Izuku wondered if he still had square-shaped molars allowing him to comply to a human's classic omnivorous diet or if his quirk made the man a complete carnivore. It wasn't unheard of for mutation quirks to change someone's dietary restrictions, for example many people with blood quirks actually needed blood to be incorporated into their diet. Maybe that's what happened to Toga, her obsession with blood could have been a result of being deprived of it. That deprivation could cause major psychotic tendencies that would definitely be enhanced by her only being able to drink the blood of those she's killed, thus associating the act of murder with a basic necessity of hers being fulfilled. It would also explain her obsession with those she has drank the blood of who have lived. It's a sort of gratefulness that's likely subconscious, like a stray cat hanging around someone that gave them food. Maybe that connection could be used to get her to change sides. In fact, he was almost certain that if someone promised her a decent supply of blood and actually followed through, then her psychotic tendencies would be completely eliminated. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a throat being cleared right next to him. He stopped and found his mouth open, tongue still morphed into the shape of his next word. He closed his mouth in shock. "Oh god, oh no," I was muttering again. "That's so horrible, he must have heard everything I thought about his quirk. Damn it Izuku, you're so annoying, you know how creepy you are when you mutter damn it, and all those things about Toga must have sounded ridiculous. I swear if I could keep my mouth shut for once in my goddamn life." Again, his thoughts were interrupted. The man on the bed in front of him began to laugh. His eyes brightened and closed as a light giggle left his lips. His face crinkled in joy and Izuku felt his face pinch in confusion. He looked back to see Izawa's tired face wearing a new expression, one that terrified him to his very core. Izawa was smirking. As much as I'd like to hear more of your analysis on Kurai and Toga's quirks, wait, he would like to hear it. I still need you to answer the question, do you know this man, Izuku? And boy, that really was an odd question, of course he didn't know this man, he'd never seen him before in his life. Wait. No. He remembered the photo, blurry and old and tucked into the gap between his mother's books. A small Polaroid with his mother and a strange man with black curly hair and sharp teeth smiling at the camera. Written on the back was Inko and Hisashi. When mom found him looking at it, that was one of the few times she truly got angry. Screaming at him and ripping the photo from his hands with her quirk, tearing the picture itself in the process. He had been 7. And the photo was of his dad. He stared at the man openly and almost afraid. He looked older now, his face stretched with worry lines in his forehead and smile lines by his eyes. His hair was longer too and styled slightly differently. He smelled like a campfire. Fire breathing. Dad. He broke again. His eyes flooded with tears as the word left his lips, so unfamiliar, so strange yet so right. The man lit up at the single word and Izuku saw his eyes well up with tears as well. But how? Why now? You left mom when she was pregnant, didn't want me. The man shook his head fiercely, his face wet with tears. No. Of course I want you, little Spark, I've wanted you from the moment I found out you were mine. He wiped at his face and grabbed something from his pocket, it was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded it and Izuku was greeted by his own face on the sheet. It was a series of images snapped from the sports festival. Some of them were of his fights, but most were from the quiet moments when he was listening to an explanation or waiting for an event to start. My sister called me, she told me to watch the first year's sports festival, the man explained, then I saw you and you just looked so much like Inko. Izuku's weakened heart clenched at the name. I knew I had to learn more about you, I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to. When I found out she was your mother I needed to know. I pulled up files, I spoke to other heroes, to old friends. The moment I found out you were mine I've kept you with me. Izuku felt himself trembling, more and more tears falling down his face. Aizawa squeezed his shoulder again. You didn't know? His voice was trembling as well, everything in his body screamed at him to just run towards the man, to hug him, to cry with him. But he had to know first, he had to know if he was right. She didn't tell me. She hid you away. That was all he needed. Izuku dived forwards, sobbing and reaching out towards the man, to Hisashi, to his dad. He caught him like he weighed nothing, picking him up and tucking him against his body. He was warm, oh so warm. And he not only smelled of campfire, but also of cinnamon. He clutched at his dad as he bawled, he felt so small, so scared yet so protected in his arms. Like he was taking the broken pieces of Izuku and putting them back together in a new way, so that this time they actually fit. This was his dad was holding him, his dad wanted him. And his mom had lied to him. Again. He sobbed harder. It hurt. His ribs ached and his chest heaved, each breath taking more and more effort. He ached deep inside his chest like there was black hole sucking up everything. He hurt and he sobbed and he mourned. He mourned the loss of his mother, the loss of his trust and the loss of his life. He mourned his childhood, he mourned the cold, air-conditioned apartment they'd shared, and most of all he mourned his mama. Because no matter how much she hurt him, no matter how much she kept from him, she was still his mom. She was still the woman who had kissed his skinned knees and held his hand crossing the street. He mourned the woman who sewed his first hero costume. He mourned the woman who patched up his cuts and bruises. He mourned the woman who had loved him. He cried and cried and cried until he couldn't anymore. Until his tear ducts were dry and his voice was hoarse. And throughout it all, his dad held him, rubbing small circles into his back and rocking back and forth. He was so warm. There kid, let it all out. I'm here. Your dad's here. My dad's here. For the third time that night, Izuku passed out. His eyes shut as he was warmed into unconsciousness. Aizawa and his father shared a look over the sleeping teen. This really was one hell of a night. That's it for today guys, hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, consider leaving a like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the author of this story. All details in description. Thanks for watching, take care.